By May 1941, Britain was already fighting for its life in the Battle of the Atlantic when Bismarck set out on her first mission. Germany was battering the sea routes Britain depended upon for food, oil, and the industrial materials needed to fuel its war effort. The strain on those supply lines had become so severe that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the Atlantic the one battle Britain could not lose. But Bismarck was the most dangerous battleship Germany had ever unleashed. She was bigger, faster, and more heavily armed than the smaller ships Britain was already struggling to contain. Churchill demanded she be destroyed, so the Royal Navy made sinking the Bismarck a top priority. What followed was not a single decisive interception, but a series of increasingly violent exchanges at sea that drove the pursuit toward Bismarck's final battle. The ship the Royal Navy was chasing was no ordinary surface ship. Britain's newest King George V-class battleships came in at about 45,000 tons ready for war. Bismarck was bigger, topping 50,000 tons. She carried 8 15-inch guns, heavy armor, and could make about 30 knots, almost the same speed as the King George V class, but quicker than many of the older British battleships still in service. And she was entering an Atlantic war that was already costing Britain heavily at sea. By the end of May 1941, Germany's U-boats alone had sunk 215 Allied ships, totaling 1.2 million tons. Their surface ships had added another 250,000 tons, and in some months, German long-range bombers added even further to Allied losses. The Royal Navy moved to intercept Bismarck early, but the first battle would not end the threat. It would increase it. Britain had already positioned its warships across the likely route Bismarck would have to use if she was heading for the Atlantic. The two ships that finally found the Germans were Rear Admiral Wake Walker's heavy cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk, patrolling the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. What they found was not Bismarck alone, but Bismarck with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Their job was not to fight, but to maintain contact until the Royal Navy's heavier ships could strike. And the pair sent to do that were Hood, the most prestigious battlecruiser in the British fleet, and Prince of Wales, the home fleet's newest battleship. The first interception was now underway. The plan was to catch Bismarck before she could break into the Atlantic. In the early hours of May 24, 1941, Hood and Prince of Wales opened fire, but the opening exchanges immediately went against them. Hood was mistakenly engaging Prince Eugen rather than Bismarck, and the German ships were already finding their range. Within minutes, the interception had turned into a gunnery duel between major warships, and the British line was sustaining heavy fire. What then followed was a disaster for the British. Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, was blown apart. Prince of Wales was damaged and driven out of the action. Bismarck had been hit as well, especially forward, but she was still afloat, still armed, and still moving. At Chequers, Churchill was woken with the news that Hood had been sunk. A little later came the second blow. Bismarck had survived, and Prince of Wales had broken off contact. The ship Britain needed to destroy was still heading for the Atlantic, and the hunt was now more urgent than ever before. On Bismarck, Admiral Gunther Lutyens, the German fleet commander, now had to assess the damage inflicted in the Denmark Strait battle. Bismarck's fuel had been lost or spoiled. The bow was riding low, and oil was spreading behind the ship. That meant she could still fight, but she could no longer roam the Atlantic as planned. So Lutyens changed course for Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast, nearly 1,700 nautical miles away, because it offered the only dry dock large enough to take Bismarck for the repairs she needed. But Lutyens still had one immediate problem to contend with: Suffolk and Norfolk. The British heavy cruisers that had located Bismarck before the battle were still hanging on behind her. So he tried to break the chase in weather that should have helped him. Lutyens turned Bismarck back toward the British cruisers, hoping to pull them away from the Prince Eugen long enough for her to slip away. The first attempt failed, and the cruiser stayed with him. But later, with fog thickening, he tried again, and this time, Prince Eugen broke clear into the weather, although Bismarck did not. So the British were still tracking the ship they wanted most, but now Bismarck had to make the run to France alone. Although even alone, Bismarck could not slip away. Fog and darkness should have hidden her, yet Suffolk and Norfolk kept finding her again and again, and their signals kept relaying her course and speed. That was what told Lutyens the British were not tracking him by sight alone. Just before 9 on the evening of May 24th, he signaled that breaking contact was impossible because of enemy radar, but that he was still making for St. Nazaire. Bismarck was now committed to a straight run for France, with the British still close enough to strike. In addition to the Suffolk and Norfolk, farther back was Admiral John Tovey, who was bringing up the main British force. King George V, the battleship carrying his flag, Victorious, the fleet carrier, 4 cruisers, and 6 destroyers. But he could not get those heavy ships into gun range before dark, so the next attack had to come from the air. To deliver it, Victorious had to launch her Swordfish torpedo bombers from about 120 miles away, the absolute limit of their range. So at 22:15, 9 Swordfish aircraft took off into the darkness and bad weather. Later that night, the Swordfish located Bismarck and flew straight into heavy anti-aircraft fire. Yet the bombers still pressed in low through the gunfire until one torpedo hit the ship. For a moment, it looked as though the strike might slow her enough for the rest of the fleet to close, but one hit was not enough to break her run to France. Britain had now attacked Bismarck twice in the space of 18 hours, first in the Denmark Strait, then from the air, and still had not managed to incapacitate her. Then, just before dawn, the whole chase turned again. Suffolk dropped radar contact during a zigzag turn and expected to recover it on the next leg as she had before. But this time, the echo never returned. At 3:06 on May 25th, Lutyens had turned hard away, increased speed, and used the gap to slip west, then north, and finally back behind the British search line. After all the fighting and all the pressure applied by the British, Bismarck was gone, and the Royal Navy was left with the one problem it thought it had solved. It had to find Bismarck all over again. After more than 30 hours of blind searching, false direction, and empty sea, an RAF Catalina finally sighted Bismarck again at 10:30 on the morning of May 26th. The plane had come down through cloud looking for the battleship and found her almost directly beneath it. Bismarck immediately opened up with anti-aircraft fire, but the Catalina still managed to send the sighting report before breaking away. Britain had her again, but only just, and now the question was whether she could be stopped before she reached the protection of Nazi-occupied France. Tovey's main force was still 135 miles to the north, 6 to 7 hours from the position the Catalina had just reported, and Bismarck would not be waiting there. She was still running for France, 690 miles from Brest, and only 320 miles from the point where German aircraft could begin to cover her retreat. At 20 knots, she could be under German air protection by dawn the following morning. That meant finding Bismarck again was not enough. She had to be slowed before she reached protection. The force best placed to do that was not Tovey's. It was Vice Admiral James Somerville's Force H, a separate British formation from Gibraltar, built around Renown, the battlecruiser Ark Royal, the fleet carrier, and Sheffield, a light cruiser. Somerville sent Sheffield ahead to shadow Bismarck, and then launched Ark Royal's Swordfish bombers to attack. But the first attempt, which reached the target area at about 15:45 that afternoon, went badly wrong. The warning that Sheffield had been deployed further forward did not reach the Swordfish crews, so when they descended through the cloud and found a warship below, they assumed it had to be Bismarck and attacked one of their own ships. Sheffield survived only because her captain threw the cruiser about at full speed, and because most of the torpedoes exploded harmlessly or missed. Bismarck had not been touched, and Britain had wasted precious time it could not spare. But the failed attack on Sheffield had at least exposed a problem with the British torpedoes. Their new magnetic pistols were detonating as soon as they struck the water, so Ark Royal's crews fitted contact detonators for the next strike instead. Then the carrier's last operational Swordfish were refueled, rearmed, and sent back into the sky for one more attack. At 1910, they began climbing off the carrier, using Sheffield as the marker that would lead them back to Bismarck. If this next strike did not take Bismarck's speed away, she would make it back to the safety of France. Shortly before 2100, the Swordfish came down through the weather and found Bismarck ahead of them. And what followed was the attack Britain had been trying to land since the Denmark Strait. The torpedo bombers pressed in through heavy fire and dropped from both sides of the battleship. One torpedo struck near the middle of the ship and did little more than throw up water and shake her. Another hit close to the stern. Down below, engine room crews felt the deck jump under their feet, and men at the back of the ship saw water burst high into the air. Bismarck had not been destroyed, but she had just taken the hit that was about to change the whole pursuit. Within minutes, the effect of the hit was clear. Captain Ernst Lindemann, Bismarck's commanding officer, tried to steady the ship, but she would not answer properly and kept turning away. The explosion had smashed the steering gear at the back of the battleship, and now she was losing speed and beginning to circle in open water. She was not sinking, and she was still dangerous, but she was no longer running cleanly for France. If Bismarck was going to survive the night, the men below had to fix the damage before the British reached her. So what followed was a desperate attempt to save the ship. Repair teams reinforced the damaged bulkhead, sealed what leaks they could, and then tried to get into the flooded spaces around the steering gear. But the stern was full of moving water, and each attempt to open the hatch ended with seawater bursting in, driving the men back and making any repair work impossible. Lindemann then tried to steer with the engines alone, varying their power again and again in the hope of forcing Bismarck back on course, but she would not hold it. The ship kept swinging back into the wind, and as night closed in, Bismarck was still crippled and still waiting for the British to arrive. The blow had done what the pursuing Royal Navy needed, and they knew it. Reports from the aircraft and from Sheffield showed Bismarck no longer steering properly, but Tovey still refused to gamble everything on a night battle in rough seas. He wanted his battleships in the right place at dawn, so the work of the night fell instead to Captain Philip Vian and 5 destroyers, Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Piorin, a force that had been pulled off convoy escort and sent in to harass Bismarck through the night. They closed in through rain and heavy seas, shadowed the crippled battleship, and attacked when they could, while Tovey brought King George V and Rodney into position, ready for an attack at first light. When dawn came on May 27th, Bismarck was no longer running, but waiting for the ships that had finally caught up with her. Vian's destroyers had held her through the night, while Somerville's Force H stayed south of the scene, outside the coming battleship action. Now Tovey's King George V and Rodney were moving in to fight, with Norfolk already off Bismarck's starboard side and Dorset Sheer farther out to starboard closing from the southeast. At 8:43, King George V sighted the German battleship through a break in the weather. 4 minutes later, Rodney opened fire. Bismarck's final battle had begun. For a few minutes, Bismarck still looked capable of a fight. She answered with her forward guns at 8:50, and one of her early salvos landed close enough to send splinters and spray across Rodney. But the British were finding their range as well. Rodney and King George V kept closing, firing, and correcting their aim, while Bismarck's damaged steering made accurate shooting harder and harder for her own gunners. Norfolk then joined the battle from about 10 miles to the east, and soon Rodney's heavy shells were smashing into the front of the German battleship. Around 9:02, Rodney's shells crashed into the bridge and conning tower, and almost everyone there was killed or badly wounded, including Admiral Lutyens and Captain Lindemann. The main gunnery control position went with them. A few minutes later, the 2 front turrets were hit and fell silent. The rear control position initially kept the rear guns firing, But the British were now too close and hitting too heavily for that to last. By about 9:15, the rear control position had been wrecked as well, and from that point on, Bismarck was no longer fighting in an organized way. She was a burning wreck, with a few isolated guns still trying to hit back. But what was left of Bismarck's gunfire did not last much longer. At about 9:21, one of the last working rear turrets was knocked out, and by 9:26, her main guns were effectively silent. Rodney, King George V, and the cruisers kept battering her at close range. Shell after shell tore through the superstructure. Fire spread, smoke erupted through shell holes and cracks. By 10 o'clock, fires were raging across Bismarck. Men could be seen climbing over the rails and jumping into the sea to escape the burning wreck. But even then, Bismarck was still afloat. What followed inside Bismarck was no longer an attempt to win the battle, but to decide how the ship would end. The surviving officers knew she could not be saved, so damage control teams were ordered to prepare scuttling charges and open the sea connections to flood her from within. Then came the order to abandon ship. Through smoke, heat, and broken steel, the surviving men began climbing out of the wreck and over the side, while Bismarck rolled under the last of the shell fire. With Bismarck defeated and the British battleships running low on fuel, Tovey ordered any ships with torpedoes to close in and finish Bismarck once and for all. Dorset Shear answered the order. She closed to about 1.5 miles on Bismarck's starboard side and fired 2 torpedoes, both of which struck home. Then she came round again, and at 10:36 sent a 3rd torpedo into her port side. After that, the list deepened fast, and Bismarck began to roll over in the sea. Hundreds of men were left in the oil-covered water. Dorset Shear and Maury began hauling survivors aboard, but at 11:40, the rescue was cut short by a suspected U-boat threat, leaving behind most of the men in the water. In London, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to announce that Bismarck had been sunk, and the reaction in Britain was one of huge relief. In Germany, the loss was felt as a national defeat and a major blow to prestige. Bismarck's entire war at sea had lasted just over 8 days. She first sailed on May 19, 1941, and by May 27th, she was sunk. Britain had ruthlessly turned her first mission into a death hunt. But strategically, Bismarck's destruction did not end the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats remained the main danger to the shipping routes around Britain, although it did end Germany's surface ship offensive. And if the Battle of the Atlantic interests you, then click the video on screen now to find out the brutal reality of life inside a German U-boat while at war.